crowded hall full of powerful people should have felt safe, yet in that single moment a young guard saw something no one else noticed, and before the music could finish its next note she stepped forward and stopped a death that had already begun moving through the room. And across the hall the Duke saw her move and understood one troubling truth. She had been waiting for it to happen. Let me take you back to where it all began. My amazing friends and family, welcome back to Jenna's Velvet Tales. Before we continue, please take a moment to subscribe. Every subscription helps us share more emotional stories. If this kind of story touches you, your support truly means a lot. Feel free to say where you're watching from, and don't forget to explore more beautiful stories here on the channel. Now, back to the story. The Grand Winter Assembly was the kind of event people spoke about for months before it happened and months after it ended. Every noble family from every province arrived at the royal palace dressed in their best clothing, hoping to be seen, hoping to be remembered, and hoping to leave with something useful, whether that meant a new alliance, a promise from the crown, or simply the favor of someone powerful. That night the palace hall was brighter than usual, filled with music and polite laughter that carried across the room as nobles spoke about trade, politics, and the quiet competitions that always lived behind friendly smiles. Servants moved carefully through the crowd holding trays of drinks while soldiers stood along the walls wearing the calm expressions expected of royal guards. Most people inside that room believed they were safe. They believed the palace walls protected them. They believed nothing dangerous could happen while the king himself stood only a few steps away speaking with visiting envoys. Yet near the edge of the hall stood someone who was not smiling, not celebrating, and not looking impressed by the gold and polished floors that surrounded her. Her name was Elara Thorne, and she had joined the royal guard only 3 months earlier. Many of the nobles in that room did not even know her name, and if they noticed her at all they likely thought she was just another quiet guard placed there to stand still and watch the doors. Elara stood straight with both hands resting calmly behind her back, her eyes moving slowly through the crowd without drawing attention to herself. She watched the way people walked, the way they spoke, the way their hands moved when they thought no one important was looking. She had learned something during her short time inside the palace. The most dangerous moment in a crowded room was the moment when everyone believed nothing could go wrong. The music continued, soft and steady, while the king laughed politely at something one of the foreign envoys said. A group of nobles nearby were discussing land taxes while another small circle spoke quietly about military funding along the northern border. Everything looked normal. Everything looked safe. But Elara noticed something that did not belong in the rhythm of the evening. A man near the center of the hall moved in a way that felt wrong. At first, there was nothing dramatic about him. He looked like another noble guest wearing a dark cloak over formal clothing, and he walked with the slow patience expected from someone who had spent years inside noble gatherings. Yet his eyes moved differently. Instead of following the conversations around him, they focused on one direction again and again. Elara noticed how he gently pushed through the crowd without speaking much, moving closer to the section of the hall where several powerful nobles stood together. Her attention sharpened. The man stopped for a moment behind a pair of diplomats who were laughing loudly about some old political disagreement that had now become a joke. Then the man's hand slipped slowly beneath his cloak. That small movement lasted only a moment, and most people would never have noticed it in such a busy room. But Elara had been watching him for the past 20 seconds, and she understood immediately what it meant. Her body moved before the rest of the hall understood anything had changed. She stepped forward with controlled speed, crossing the space between them in a direct line while her hand moved toward the sword at her side. The man had just begun to pull a thin blade from beneath his cloak when Elara reached him. In one sharp motion she knocked his wrist sideways and forced the blade away from its path while her other hand pushed him hard against the nearest table. The sudden movement startled the nobles nearby. Several people stepped backward in confusion while one woman gasped loudly as the table shook beneath the force of the struggle. The music stopped mid-note. 2 nearby guards rushed forward immediately, grabbing the attacker's arms while Elara stepped back half a pace, her sword now drawn but steady. The entire hall filled with voices as people began asking questions all at once. "What is happening?" someone demanded. "Was that a weapon?" another voice said in disbelief. A senior officer of the guard quickly approached while the attacker was forced to his knees. The king's advisors moved closer to their ruler, forming a protective circle around him while the visiting envoys looked shocked by the sudden chaos. Captain Rowan Cade, commander of the Royal Guard, stepped into the center of the scene with a sharp voice that cut through the confusion. "Clear space. Now!" Guards guided the nearby nobles away while the attacker was searched and restrained. When the blade was held up for the captain to see, a quiet tension spread through the room. It was not a ceremonial knife or something carried for show. It was narrow, sharp, and clearly meant for killing. Who was the target? One of the advisors whispered urgently. Many eyes turned toward the king. It seemed obvious. A weapon inside the royal assembly could only mean one thing. Yet not everyone in the room believed that explanation. Across the hall, Duke Adrian Valmere had been watching the entire moment from the beginning. He had not moved from his place near one of the tall windows that overlooked the palace gardens. While other nobles reacted with shock, Adrian's expression remained thoughtful, almost curious. His eyes did not stay on the captured attacker. Instead, they moved slowly toward the young guard who had stopped him. Elara had already returned her sword to its place and now stood quietly near the edge of the cleared space while the captain questioned the prisoner. She looked calm. Too calm. Adrian had spent many years observing people during moments of stress. He had watched soldiers in battle reports, diplomats during tense negotiations, and nobles when their secrets were suddenly threatened. Most people revealed something in their expressions when danger appeared without warning. Fear, anger, surprise, relief. Yet the young guard showed none of those things. She looked exactly like someone who had done what she expected to do. Adrian's gaze narrowed slightly. A noble standing beside him spoke in a low voice. That was quick thinking from the guard. Adrian nodded slowly, though his eyes remained on Elara. "Yes," he replied after a short pause. "Quick." The noble beside him chuckled nervously. "Well, I suppose the king is fortunate she happened to notice." Adrian did not answer immediately. His attention followed the memory of those few seconds again in his mind. He remembered where the guard had been standing before the attack. He remembered how she had already been facing the direction of the attacker before the weapon appeared. And that detail stayed with him longer than anything else. Finally he spoke quietly. "She did not happen to notice." The noble frowned. "What do you mean?" Adrian's voice remained calm. "She was already moving before the blade was fully drawn." The noble looked confused, unsure how to respond. Meanwhile, the captain finished securing the attacker and ordered several guards to take him away for questioning. The tension in the room slowly began to settle, though the mood of celebration had clearly changed. Conversations became quieter, more careful. No one could ignore the fact that a weapon had been pulled inside the palace during one of the most important gatherings of the year. As servants began repairing the disturbed tables and musicians hesitantly returned to their instruments, Adrian continued watching the guard who had caused the entire room to change. Elara felt the Duke's attention before she actually looked toward him. Something about the quiet pressure of his gaze made her turn slightly. For a brief moment their eyes met across the hall. Adrian expected the guard to look away quickly like most soldiers would when meeting the gaze of a powerful noble. Instead, she held the look for a second longer than expected, calm and steady, before returning her attention to the room. That brief exchange told Adrian something important. The guard was not nervous around powerful people. And people who were not nervous inside the palace usually had a reason. A short time later, once the worst of the confusion had settled, Adrian stepped away from the window and began walking slowly across the hall. The conversations around him continued in careful voices as he passed groups of nobles who were still discussing what had just happened. His path led directly toward the young guard standing near one of the tall pillars along the wall. Elara noticed him approaching but did not move. When the Duke stopped in front of her, several nearby nobles quietly stepped aside, curious to see what he might say. Adrian studied her for a moment before speaking. "You moved quickly." Elara gave a respectful nod. "It was my duty." Adrian's expression remained thoughtful. Most guards would not have noticed that movement so early. Elara answered without hesitation. "Sometimes small details matter." Adrian allowed a faint smile to appear. "They do." A brief silence followed before he continued. "What is your name, guard?" "Elara Thorne, your grace." Adrian repeated the name quietly as if storing it somewhere in his memory. "And how long have you served in the royal guard, Elara Thorne?" 3 months. One of Adrian's eyebrows lifted slightly. 3 months, he said softly. Then tonight must feel like quite an introduction to palace life. Elara did not smile. Danger does not wait for experience. Adrian studied her face carefully, noticing the controlled calm behind her eyes. "No," he said slowly. "It usually does not." Their conversation ended there, yet something unspoken passed between them before Adrian turned away and walked back toward the center of the hall. As he left, Elara watched him go with quiet attention. The Duke of Valmere was known for many things in the kingdom: wealth, influence, and a reputation for understanding people far better than they expected. She had hoped he might not notice her too closely tonight. But the way he had looked at her suggested that hope might already be fading. And somewhere deep inside the palace, behind thick walls where the captured attacker was now being questioned, a quiet truth waited to be uncovered. Because the weapon that had appeared in the crowded hall had never been meant for the king at all. And the man who truly stood in danger that night had only just begun to realize it. The Duke of Valmere. And somewhere nearby, Elara Thorne was still watching. The Duke of Valmere did not leave the hall immediately after speaking with the young guard. Instead, he walked slowly through the crowd as if nothing important had happened, greeting several nobles who approached him and answering their questions with polite patience. Yet behind his calm face his thoughts kept returning to the same moment again and again. He had seen many guards react to danger before. He had seen bravery and fear and sometimes even hesitation. But what he had witnessed from Elara Thorne had been something different. It had not looked like a reaction. It had looked like preparation. And that difference troubled him more than the weapon itself. Meanwhile, the music inside the hall began again, though the joy it carried earlier had softened. Nobles still spoke, but their laughter no longer rose as easily. A quiet awareness now lived in the room. Servants replaced disturbed glasses and plates while the royal advisors remained close to the king, speaking quietly among themselves. Near the far side of the hall, Elara had returned to her position along the wall, standing still with the same quiet attention she carried earlier. To anyone watching casually, she looked like a guard simply continuing her duty. But her mind was moving carefully through everything that had just happened. She had expected the attack tonight. Not the exact moment, not the exact man, but she had known something would happen during the assembly. Too many pieces had been moving inside the palace over the past few weeks. Too many quiet meetings. Too many whispers that stopped when someone else entered the room. And most important of all, too many people watching the Duke of Valmere when they thought no one else noticed. Elara had spent months studying the palace, not only the walls and doors but the people themselves. She had learned which nobles enjoyed loud attention and which preferred quiet influence. She had learned which servants carried gossip between halls and which soldiers held grudges from old commands. Her father had taught her something long ago when she was still a child, watching him work late into the night with stacks of documents spread across their table. Truth inside a palace rarely hides in darkness. It hides in patterns. Tonight one of those patterns had finally stepped forward with a blade. Across the hall, Adrian paused beside a group of military officers who were discussing the disturbance in low voices. One officer shook his head slowly. "Security inside the palace will be doubled after this. The king will demand it." Another officer nodded. He should. An attack during the Grand Winter Assembly could have ended much worse. Adrian listened quietly before speaking. "Do we know the attacker's name yet?" One officer answered. "Not yet, Your Grace. The captain has taken him below for questioning." Adrian nodded politely, though his thoughts remained elsewhere. After a moment he excused himself and continued walking toward one of the side doors that led into a quieter corridor. As he stepped away from the crowd, the sounds of the gathering softened behind him. The corridor beyond the hall was lit by tall lamps placed along the walls. 2 guards stood near the entrance, both giving the Duke a respectful nod as he passed. Adrian did not stop until he reached the far end of the corridor where a large window overlooked the palace courtyard. From there he could see the dark outline of the city stretching beyond the palace gates. The lights of distant homes flickered quietly in the night. For a moment he simply stood there, letting the calm space clear his thoughts. But his mind refused to rest. The attacker had not looked toward the king when he drew the blade. Adrian had noticed that detail very clearly. The man had been moving through the crowd toward a group of nobles standing only a few steps away from where Adrian himself had been speaking earlier. That memory sat heavily in his mind. And then there was the whisper he had heard from one of the guards while the prisoner was taken away. A whisper spoken too softly for most people to notice. The attacker had asked one question while being dragged toward the lower halls. "Is the Duke still in the room?" Adrian slowly folded his hands behind his back. That single sentence carried more weight than the blade itself. Footsteps approached from behind him. Adrian turned slightly and saw Captain Rowan Cade walking down the corridor with a serious expression. The captain stopped a short distance away and gave a respectful bow of his head. "Your Grace." Adrian returned the nod. "Captain, I assume the prisoner is being questioned." Rowan's face remained firm. "Yes, though he has not been cooperative." Adrian studied him carefully. "Has he spoken at all?" The captain hesitated for a moment before answering. "Only once." Adrian waited. Rowan continued. "He said the king was never the target." Adrian's eyes narrowed slightly, though his voice remained calm. "And did he say who was?" Rowan shook his head slowly. "No. But before we could question him further, he refused to speak again." Silence settled between them for a moment. Adrian looked back toward the dark courtyard through the window. "Interesting." Rowan shifted his weight slightly. "Your Grace, if I may ask something." Adrian turned his attention back to the captain. "Of course." Rowan spoke carefully. "During the incident, you were watching the guard who stopped the attacker." Adrian allowed the faintest smile to appear. "You noticed that?" Rowan gave a small nod. "I notice many things." Adrian considered this before answering. "Then you may also have noticed something else." Rowan waited. Adrian continued quietly. "She moved before the weapon was fully drawn." Rowan's expression grew thoughtful. "Yes, I noticed that as well." Adrian looked directly at him. "How long has she served under your command?" 3 months. Adrian repeated the number softly. "A short time to develop instincts like that." Rowan folded his arms loosely behind his back. "Elara Thorne is one of the most observant guards I have trained. She rarely speaks unless necessary, but she sees more than most soldiers twice her age." Adrian tilted his head slightly. "And her background?" Rowan hesitated again, this time longer. Adrian noticed the pause immediately. "There is something you are not saying, Captain." Rowan let out a quiet breath. "Her father once worked for the crown." Adrian waited. Rowan finished the sentence carefully. "He served as a royal investigator." Adrian's attention sharpened. "And where is he now?" Rowan's voice lowered. "He was executed 12 years ago." Adrian's expression changed slightly, though only someone watching closely would notice it. "Executed." Rowan nodded once. "For treason." The corridor remained silent for several seconds after those words. Adrian turned back toward the window again, watching the distant lights of the city. "What kind of treason?" Rowan answered slowly. "He accused several nobles within the court of corruption. His investigation caused significant unrest." Adrian spoke quietly, and the crown believed those accusations were false. Rowan did not respond immediately. Instead, he said something careful. The crown believed his actions threatened the stability of the kingdom. Adrian allowed that answer to settle before speaking again. "And now his daughter stands inside the palace wearing the uniform of the royal guard." Rowan nodded once more. Adrian's voice remained calm but thoughtful. "Tell me something honestly, Captain. Did you know about her father when she joined the guard?" Rowan met the Duke's gaze directly. "Yes." Adrian raised one eyebrow slightly. "And you still accepted her?" Rowan's answer came without hesitation. "She passed every test. Discipline, skill, loyalty." Adrian studied the captain's face for a moment before asking one final question. And trust. Rowan held the Duke's gaze steadily. So far. Adrian gave a quiet nod and turned back toward the window. The night outside the palace looked peaceful. Yet inside the walls a different kind of movement had begun. Somewhere within the lower halls of the palace the captured attacker sat in chains, refusing to speak further. Somewhere within the gathering behind them nobles were still discussing the disturbance with uneasy curiosity. And somewhere along the outer wall of the ballroom a quiet young guard continued watching every movement around her with the patience of someone waiting for the next piece of a much larger puzzle. Adrian finally spoke again. "Thank you, Captain." Rowan bowed his head slightly. "Your Grace." The captain turned and walked back toward the ballroom entrance, leaving Adrian alone in the quiet corridor. For a long moment the Duke remained standing beside the window, thinking carefully about everything he had learned tonight. Then slowly he spoke to himself, though no one else was there to hear the words. "Elara Thorne," he said quietly, "what exactly are you doing inside my palace?" Back in the ballroom Elara stood exactly where she had been earlier, watching the crowd as the music continued once more. From the outside she looked calm and patient like any loyal guard protecting the royal gathering. But deep inside her mind a single thought had begun repeating itself since the moment the Duke approached her earlier. He had seen too much. And that meant the careful plan she had spent months building inside the palace might now be moving faster than she expected. Because the truth she was searching for inside those walls was not a small truth. It was a dangerous one. The kind of truth powerful people would kill to keep buried. And if Elara Thorne was correct about what she had discovered over the past few months, then the blade drawn tonight had only been the beginning. Somewhere inside the palace another move was already waiting. And when that moment arrived, the next target would not be the king. It would be Duke Adrian Valmere. And the most dangerous part of all was something neither of them fully understood yet. Elara had come to the palace searching for the man responsible for her father's death. But the deeper she looked into the shadows of the court, the more the path of that truth seemed to lead directly toward the Duke himself. Inside the ballroom the music continued again, but the mood had changed. People still smiled, yet the smiles now carried questions behind them. Every group of nobles spoke about the same thing, though they tried to keep their voices low. A weapon had been drawn in the middle of the Grand Winter Assembly, and even though the danger had passed quickly, no one could ignore what it meant. Elara remained at her post near the pillar, her eyes moving slowly across the hall. She listened without appearing to listen. Small pieces of conversation drifted through the room as people talked quietly. "Did you see the blade?" One noble whispered to another. "I heard it was meant for the king." "No one knows that yet," the other replied. "Still, it should not have happened here." Elara kept her expression calm while she watched the movements of everyone nearby. She had learned long ago that people revealed more when they believed the danger had passed. And tonight many people in this hall believed the problem had already been solved. But Elara knew better. The man with the blade had not been the beginning. He had been a message. And the message was meant for someone powerful. A few moments later Captain Rowan returned to the hall from the corridor and walked directly toward her. His steps were steady, though his eyes carried the sharp focus of someone thinking hard about something. When he reached her side he stopped without turning his head toward her, speaking in a voice quiet enough that only she could hear. "The Duke has been asking questions." Elara answered without moving. That was expected. Rowan kept his gaze forward toward the crowd. "You handled the attack well, but you moved faster than most guards would have." Elara gave the smallest nod. The moment required it. Rowan paused briefly, then said something that carried more weight. "You knew something might happen tonight." Elara's eyes moved toward a group of diplomats near the center of the room before she replied. "I suspected." Rowan turned his head slightly now, studying her profile. Suspicion is different from certainty. Elara finally looked toward him. "If I had been certain, Captain, I would have stopped it before the blade was drawn." Rowan held her gaze for a moment before looking forward again. "Perhaps." The captain did not press the matter further. Instead he said quietly, "Remain alert. If someone inside this hall planned the attack, they will be watching the reaction closely. Elara answered softly. They already are. Rowan nodded once and moved away to continue his patrol of the room. As he left, Elara's attention shifted again across the hall. She had noticed something small while speaking with him. A man near the far side of the ballroom had been watching their conversation with too much interest. He was older, dressed in deep blue formal clothing, speaking politely with two visiting nobles while occasionally glancing in her direction. His name was Lord Benedict Hale, one of the king's most trusted advisors. To most people inside the palace he appeared calm, intelligent, and loyal to the crown. Yet Elara had been watching him for weeks, and the pattern of his movements had begun to trouble her more with each passing day. Meanwhile, Duke Adrian had returned to the ballroom after his conversation with Captain Rowan. As he stepped inside the hall again, the first thing he noticed was how many people were now watching the guards instead of the celebration. Fear changed the way people looked at soldiers. Before the attack, the guards had been background figures. Now they were reminders that something dangerous had nearly happened. Adrian walked slowly through the room again, greeting familiar faces while quietly observing the behavior of those around him. His mind remained fixed on two things: the captured attacker, and the guard named Elara Thorne. As he approached a table where several nobles were speaking, one of them immediately addressed him. "Your Grace, I hope this unpleasant situation will not ruin the evening." Adrian gave a polite smile. "I doubt it will ruin anything. If anything, it has reminded everyone here that the palace guard is doing its job." Another noble leaned closer. "Still, one wonders how a man with a weapon entered the hall in the first place." Adrian lifted his glass calmly. "Palaces are built to impress visitors, not to trap them. Doors must open both ways." The nobles nodded thoughtfully. Yet Adrian's eyes moved briefly toward the far wall where Elara stood again. The guard had returned to stillness, though he noticed that her gaze never remained in one place for long. She watched the room the way a hunter watched a forest. Slowly, carefully, patiently, Adrian finished his drink and placed the glass back onto the table. Then he said politely, "If you will excuse me." He moved away from the group and began walking toward the center of the hall where several important nobles had gathered near the king. As he approached, Lord Benedict Hale noticed him and stepped forward with a welcoming expression. "Your Grace," Benedict said warmly. "Quite an evening." Adrian gave a polite nod. "Indeed." Benedict glanced briefly around the room before speaking again. "It is fortunate the guard acted so quickly. Without her intervention, the consequences might have been far worse." Adrian studied the advisor's face carefully. "You believe the king was the intended target?" Benedict shrugged lightly. "It would seem the obvious conclusion." Adrian answered slowly. "Sometimes the obvious answer is not the correct one." Benedict watched him with interest. "You sound unconvinced." Adrian held his gaze calmly. "I prefer evidence to assumptions." Benedict smiled faintly. "A wise habit." The advisor then changed the subject smoothly, asking about matters of trade between provinces and the recent harvest reports from Adrian's lands. Their conversation continued politely for several minutes while nearby nobles listened with casual interest. Yet beneath the surface of their calm discussion, both men were measuring each other carefully. Adrian noticed that Benedict asked many questions but revealed very little of his own thoughts. Meanwhile, Benedict observed the Duke's reactions with equal care. When the conversation finally ended, Benedict bowed his head slightly. "I hope the remainder of the evening proves more peaceful." Adrian gave a polite nod. "As do I." The advisor turned away to speak with another noble, leaving Adrian standing near the center of the hall. For a moment the Duke remained there quietly, watching the flow of the gathering around him. Something about Benedict's behavior felt too smooth, too controlled, and that detail stayed with him as he slowly stepped away toward the edge of the hall once more. Near the far wall, Elara had also noticed the exchange between the Duke and the advisor. She had not heard their words, but she had seen the way Benedict studied Adrian during the conversation. And she had seen something else as well. When Benedict believed no one was watching, his eyes had briefly moved toward her. That single glance confirmed something Elara had begun to suspect over the past month. The advisor knew she was watching him. The music ended again as the king rose to address the assembly. Conversations faded quickly as the crowd turned toward the center of the hall. The king spoke with practiced confidence, thanking the nobles for their loyalty and celebrating the unity of the kingdom during the winter season. Applause followed his words while the atmosphere slowly began to recover from the earlier shock. Yet even as the speech continued, several people inside the hall were thinking about very different things. Adrian listened to the king's speech while quietly watching the faces around him. Benedict Hale stood only a few steps away, smiling politely like every other noble present. Elara remained at her post near the wall, though her attention moved carefully between several individuals scattered through the crowd. And somewhere deep below the palace, inside a cold chamber meant for prisoners, the man who had drawn the blade sat chained to a wooden chair under the watch of 2 guards. The room smelled faintly of stone and oil from the lamps placed along the walls. Captain Rowan stood across from the prisoner with his arms folded. "You will speak eventually," he said calmly. The prisoner remained silent, his head lowered slightly. Rowan stepped closer. "The longer you wait, the worse your situation becomes." Still the prisoner said nothing. Rowan studied him for a moment before asking quietly, "Who hired you?" No answer came. Rowan sighed softly. "Very well." He turned toward the guard standing beside the door. "Bring the Duke." The guard looked surprised. "The Duke, Captain?" Rowan nodded. "Yes." The guard left quickly to carry out the order. Several minutes later the door opened again and Adrian Valmere stepped inside the chamber. His eyes moved calmly across the room before resting on the prisoner. Rowan spoke quietly. "He refuses to speak." Adrian approached slowly, stopping a few steps in front of the chained man. For a moment he said nothing. Then he spoke in a calm voice. "You asked earlier if I was still in the hall." The prisoner slowly lifted his head. Adrian continued. "I am." Silence filled the chamber. Adrian studied the man carefully before asking one simple question. "Who sent you?" The prisoner's lips moved slightly. His voice came out rough but clear. "You already know." Adrian's eyes narrowed slightly. "Do I?" The prisoner gave a faint, tired smile. "You just don't want to believe it yet." Adrian held his gaze steadily. "Try me." The prisoner leaned back against the chair and spoke quietly. "You should watch the people closest to you, Duke Valmere." Rowan stepped forward sharply. "Enough games. Give us a name." But the prisoner shook his head slowly. "Names won't matter soon." Adrian's voice remained calm. "Why not?" The prisoner's eyes darkened slightly as he answered. "Because the next move has already begun." Rowan leaned forward angrily. "What next move?" The prisoner looked directly at Adrian. "The one meant to finish what tonight started." Adrian studied the man's expression carefully. "And what exactly did tonight start?" The prisoner smiled faintly despite the chains around his wrists. "The fall of the Duke." The chamber fell silent after those words. Rowan looked toward Adrian, waiting for his reaction. But the Duke simply stood there quietly for several seconds, his expression unreadable. Then he turned calmly toward the captain. "Keep him alive," Adrian said. Rowan nodded. Adrian walked toward the door, though he stopped briefly before leaving the room. Without turning back he spoke one final sentence. "Because I intend to prove him wrong." Then he stepped into the corridor and the heavy door closed behind him. Back in the ballroom above, the music began once more as the assembly continued late into the night. Yet inside the palace walls a dangerous truth had begun to move quietly between shadows. Someone inside the court wanted Duke Adrian Valmere dead. And the only person who seemed to understand that danger before it arrived was the young guard who had acted first in the crowded hall. Elara Thorne. But even she did not yet know how deep the truth would reach when it finally revealed itself. And before the night ended, the palace would give them both another reason to realize that the attack earlier had only been the beginning. Adrian walked through the palace corridor with slow, steady steps, though his mind was moving much faster than his feet. The prisoner's words followed him like a shadow that refused to fade. The fall of the Duke. Those had been the exact words. Not the fall of the king. Not the fall of the court. His fall. That detail changed everything. When Adrian reached the end of the corridor, he paused beside a tall window that overlooked the palace courtyard. The night outside was still, and the distant city lights flickered quietly beyond the gates. Anyone looking at the palace from the outside would have believed the royal celebration was continuing without trouble. Music, laughter, noble conversations. Yet inside the walls, the calm had begun to crack. Adrian rested one hand behind his back and looked down into the courtyard while thinking carefully about what he had learned tonight. If the prisoner spoke the truth, then the attack in the ballroom had not been meant to strike the king. It had been meant to create confusion, fear, and attention. And during that confusion, someone else might have been preparing something far more precise. A voice behind him spoke gently. "Your Grace." Adrian turned and saw Elara standing a few steps away in the corridor entrance. She had left her position in the ballroom only moments earlier, though she had chosen her timing carefully so no one would question her absence. Adrian studied her quietly for a moment. "Guard Thorne." Elara stepped forward and stopped at a respectful distance. "Captain Rowan informed me that you questioned the prisoner." Adrian nodded slightly. "I did." Elara waited. Adrian noticed that patience again. She never rushed a conversation. She allowed silence to speak first. Finally he said, "He claims the king was not the target." Elara's eyes did not change. "I suspected that." Adrian watched her carefully. "Did you?" She gave a small nod. The attacker was moving toward the section of the hall where several nobles stood. The king was too far away. Adrian's expression grew thoughtful. "And which noble do you believe he was approaching?" Elara held his gaze calmly. "You." The corridor remained silent for several seconds after that word. Adrian did not appear surprised. Instead he asked quietly, "And how did you come to that conclusion?" Elara answered simply, "Because the man kept looking in your direction while moving through the crowd." Adrian tilted his head slightly. "Interesting." Elara continued in the same calm voice. "And because the blade he carried was narrow. It was meant for a quick strike at close range, not for reaching someone across a large space." Adrian folded his hands behind his back again. "You notice many details." Elara did not deny it. Adrian looked at her more carefully now. "Tell me something honestly, Guard Thorne. Were you watching that man before he moved toward me?" Elara answered after a brief pause. "Yes." Adrian raised one eyebrow. "Why?" Elara spoke carefully, choosing her words with quiet control. "Because I believed something might happen tonight." Adrian let out a slow breath. "That makes two of us." For the first time, a small shadow of curiosity crossed Elara's expression. "You expected trouble as well?" Adrian looked back toward the dark courtyard before answering. "When you spend enough years inside a royal court, you begin to recognize when certain conversations become too quiet." Elara understood what he meant. Palace conspiracies rarely announced themselves loudly. They moved through whispers and glances. Adrian turned back toward her. "Tell me something else. Did you know the attacker?" Elara shook her head. "No." Adrian watched her face carefully. "But you suspected someone would try to reach me tonight." Elara did not answer immediately. Finally she said, "I believed someone inside the palace might attempt something during the assembly." Adrian's eyes narrowed slightly. "Someone inside the palace?" Elara nodded once. Adrian stepped closer to the window again. "That is a serious suspicion." Elara's voice remained steady. "Yes." Adrian looked at her again. "And what made you suspect such a thing?" Elara hesitated, not because she lacked an answer, but because the truth behind that answer was far larger than the Duke understood yet. Finally she said quietly, "Patterns." Adrian smiled faintly. That word again. Elara's eyes held his. "Patterns reveal more than secrets." Adrian studied her for a long moment. Then he said something unexpected. "Your father believed the same thing." Elara's posture stiffened almost too slightly for most people to notice. But Adrian noticed. Her voice remained controlled when she replied. "You know about my father." Adrian nodded once. Captain Rowan mentioned him. Elara looked down briefly, though her thoughts moved quickly. Adrian continued gently. "He served the crown as an investigator." Elara answered quietly, "Yes." Adrian spoke the next part slowly. "And he died after accusing several nobles of corruption." Elara lifted her eyes again. "That is what the court records say." Adrian watched her closely. "Do you believe those accusations were true?" Elara held his gaze without fear. "I believe my father died trying to protect the kingdom." Adrian remained silent for a moment. Then he said softly, "Many people inside this palace believed the same thing." Elara looked surprised by that answer, though she hid it well. Adrian continued, "The problem was not whether he discovered corruption. The problem was who he discovered." Elara's voice lowered slightly. "You know something." Adrian met her gaze calmly. "I know that powerful people do not forgive easily when someone threatens their influence." The tension between them deepened slightly. Elara spoke carefully. "Is that why you think someone tried to kill you tonight?" Adrian allowed a faint smile. "If someone inside the court feared I might follow your father's path, then removing me would certainly make their lives easier." Elara looked at him thoughtfully now. Something about his calm honesty made her reconsider several things she had assumed about the Duke during her months inside the palace. Adrian noticed her expression change slightly. "You are wondering whether you misjudged me." Elara answered honestly. "I am reconsidering certain possibilities." Adrian chuckled quietly. "Fair enough." The moment between them stretched for a few seconds before Adrian asked another question. "Tell me something, Guard Thorne. Did you join the royal guard to protect the crown?" Elara answered without hesitation. "Yes." Adrian tilted his head slightly. "Only that." Elara met his gaze calmly. "And to learn the truth about my father." Adrian nodded slowly. "I suspected as much." The honesty of that answer surprised her again. Adrian continued, "Then perhaps we are searching for the same truth." Elara's voice grew quieter. "Perhaps." Before either of them could say more, hurried footsteps echoed through the corridor behind them. Captain Rowan appeared moments later with a tense expression. "Your Grace," he said quickly. Adrian turned toward him. "What is it?" Rowan spoke in a low voice. "The prisoner is dead." Silence filled the corridor immediately. Adrian's eyes sharpened. "How?" Rowan answered grimly. "Poison." Elara stepped forward slightly. "That should not have been possible." Rowan nodded. "It should not have been." Yet when the guard returned with water, the prisoner collapsed before anyone could react. Adrian's voice lowered. "Which means someone inside the palace wanted him silent." Rowan nodded again. Adrian looked briefly toward Elara. She already understood the meaning behind that information. The conspiracy was not just outside the palace walls. It was already inside. Adrian spoke calmly despite the growing tension. "Then whoever planned the attack has now erased the only witness." Rowan added quietly, "And they did it within the palace itself." Elara's mind moved quickly through the possibilities. Someone had delivered poison to a prisoner under heavy guard in one of the most secure sections of the palace. That required access, planning, and help from someone inside the guard or servant staff. Adrian turned slowly toward the ballroom entrance. Music could still be heard faintly beyond the doors. Nobles were still laughing, unaware that the situation had just grown far more dangerous. Adrian spoke quietly. "The person responsible for this is still inside the palace tonight." Rowan's jaw tightened. "Yes." Adrian looked toward Elara again. "And if the attacker truly came for me," Elara finished the thought calmly, "then the next attempt will be more careful." Adrian nodded slowly. The three of them stood there in the quiet corridor while the sound of celebration drifted from the ballroom behind them. Somewhere among the hundreds of guests, servants, and soldiers inside the palace that night was the person who had ordered the attack. And that person had already shown they were willing to kill again to keep their secret safe. Adrian looked toward the ballroom doors once more. Then we continue the evening as if nothing has changed. Rowan frowned slightly. Your Grace. Adrian answered calmly. If our enemy believes the first attempt failed quietly, they may grow impatient. Elara understood immediately. And impatient people make mistakes. Adrian gave a small nod. Exactly. Rowan looked between them both. You intend to stay in the ballroom? Adrian's answer came without hesitation. Yes. Elara stepped forward slightly. Then I will remain close. Adrian allowed a faint smile to return. I suspected you might. The three of them began walking back toward the ballroom together. Yet as the doors opened and the sound of music filled the corridor again, none of them knew that another pair of eyes had been watching their conversation from the shadows further down the hall. And the person hiding there had just learned something important. The Duke and the guard were beginning to understand the game, which meant the next move would have to come sooner than planned. And this time, the mistake would not be allowed to fail. The Grand Winter Assembly continued late into the night. But the most dangerous moment of the evening had not yet arrived. And before the celebration ended, someone in that palace would make one final attempt to ensure the Duke of Valmere never left the hall alive. Adrian pushed the tall doors open and stepped back into the ballroom. The music was louder again, and many of the nobles had already returned to their conversations as if the earlier incident had been nothing more than a brief disturbance. Laughter rose from one corner of the hall while a group of diplomats spoke over glasses of wine near the long tables. From the outside, the celebration looked whole again. But Adrian knew better now. Elara followed a few steps behind him and returned quietly to the edge of the hall. Captain Rowan moved toward the other guards stationed along the walls and gave a few quiet orders that no one else noticed. The change was small but important. 2 additional guards now stood near the doors leading deeper into the palace. Another guard moved closer to the king. Most people in the room did not notice the shift in security, but someone watching carefully would have understood that the palace guard was no longer relaxed. Adrian walked slowly through the gathering again, greeting familiar faces as if his thoughts were not racing. A nobleman stopped him near the center of the hall. Your Grace, I trust the disturbance has been resolved. Adrian gave a calm smile. It appears to have been handled. The noble nodded with relief. Good. One would hate for such a celebration to be remembered for violence. Adrian lifted his glass politely. History often remembers the moments we try hardest to forget. The noble laughed lightly and turned back toward his companions. Adrian moved away from the conversation and walked toward one of the tall columns near the wall. From there he could observe most of the hall without attracting attention. Elara noticed where he positioned himself and adjusted her own stance slightly so she could see both the Duke and the nearest entrance at the same time. She had already begun studying every servant moving through the crowd. Servants were often invisible to nobles, yet they had the freedom to move anywhere in the palace. If someone had delivered poison to the prisoner below, a servant might have carried it. Her attention moved across the hall again until her eyes settled briefly on Lord Benedict Hale. The royal advisor stood near the king speaking quietly with 2 visiting nobles. His posture was relaxed, and his face carried the same calm smile he always wore during public gatherings. Yet something about the timing of the prisoner's death troubled Elara deeply. The man had died only minutes after the Duke began asking questions. That kind of speed suggested planning. Someone had been prepared to silence him the moment he became a threat. Meanwhile, Adrian remained still beside the column while his thoughts moved through several possibilities. He looked around the room slowly. Hundreds of people were present. Nobles, soldiers, servants, diplomats. If someone wanted him dead tonight, they had many ways to attempt it again. A poisoned drink, a concealed blade. Even a simple push from a balcony above the hall could create enough confusion to hide the truth. Adrian allowed himself a quiet breath before moving again. As he stepped away from the column, Elara noticed and began walking slowly along the wall to keep him within sight. Their movements were subtle. To anyone watching casually, it looked like nothing more than a guard adjusting her position during duty. Adrian approached a table where several older nobles were discussing the kingdom's trade routes. As he greeted them politely, A servant approached carrying a tray of drinks. The servant offered the tray first to one of the nobles and then turned toward Adrian. "Wine, Your Grace." Adrian reached toward the tray but stopped halfway. Something about the servant's hand caught his attention. The man's sleeve had shifted slightly, revealing a faint mark along the wrist. Adrian had seen that mark before on soldiers returning from certain regions of the kingdom. It was a burn left by a particular type of military signal device used in the northern provinces. Servants did not normally carry such marks. Adrian's hand paused above the tray. The servant noticed the hesitation and looked up. For a brief moment their eyes met. Then the servant's expression changed. Adrian moved faster than most nobles ever did. His hand grabbed the servant's wrist and twisted sharply, forcing the tray to fall to the floor as the glasses shattered. The sudden noise cut through the music instantly. Nobles stepped back in shock while guards rushed forward from every direction. The servant struggled violently, reaching toward his belt with his free hand. But Elara was already moving. She crossed the distance in seconds and struck the man's arm before he could draw the small blade hidden beneath his clothing. The blade clattered across the floor as two guards seized the attacker and forced him down. The ballroom erupted into confusion once again. Voices rose everywhere. "Another attacker," someone shouted. Captain Rowan pushed through the crowd immediately. "Clear space," he ordered. Guards formed a circle around the captured man while servants quickly pulled frightened nobles away from the center of the hall. Adrian remained standing exactly where he was, his grip still tight on the attacker's wrist until Rowan secured the man in chains. Rowan looked up at the Duke. "You recognized something?" Adrian nodded slightly. "The mark on his wrist." Rowan frowned. "A soldier's burn." Adrian's voice remained calm. "Yes. But this man is dressed as a servant." Rowan turned toward the prisoner. "Who sent you?" The man did not answer. His eyes moved briefly across the room before settling on Elara. For a moment his expression hardened with anger. Then something unexpected happened. The man began laughing quietly. The sound was low, but it carried through the sudden silence of the hall. Rowan grabbed his collar roughly. "You find this amusing?" The prisoner looked past Rowan toward Adrian. "You were supposed to drink it." Adrian glanced toward the shattered glasses on the floor. Rowan's eyes widened slightly. "Poison." The prisoner smiled. "Of course." Rowan's grip tightened. "Who gave it to you?" The man's smile faded slowly. Then he spoke one calm sentence. "The same person who killed the first prisoner." The hall grew even quieter. Adrian stepped forward slightly. "And who would that be?" The attacker looked around the room slowly, his gaze passing across dozens of faces. Nobles stared back with shock, anger, or fear. The man's eyes finally stopped on someone near the king's side of the hall. Adrian followed the direction of that gaze carefully, and for a brief second he believed he understood. But before the prisoner could speak the name, something struck him from across the hall. The man jerked violently and collapsed to the floor. Rowan knelt immediately beside him while the guards pulled back in shock. A thin dart protruded from the prisoner's neck. Rowan cursed under his breath. "Not again." The man's breathing stopped within seconds. Silence spread across the ballroom like a wave. Adrian slowly lifted his head and looked toward the upper balcony that ran along one side of the hall. Several guests had been standing there earlier watching the celebration from above. Now the balcony was empty. Elara had already reached the staircase leading upward. She turned back briefly toward Adrian. "Stay here." Then she ran up the stairs 2 steps at a time. Rowan signaled 2 guards to follow her. Adrian watched them disappear onto the balcony above while the nobles below whispered nervously among themselves. Whoever was responsible for the attack had just silenced a second witness. And they had done it in front of the entire assembly. A few minutes later Elara returned from the balcony with the 2 guards behind her. Her expression was calm but serious. Rowan looked at her immediately. "Did you find anyone?" She shook her head. "No. Whoever fired the dart was already gone." Adrian spoke quietly, which means they knew exactly when the man would speak. Elara nodded slowly. Rowan stood and looked around the hall. "Your Grace, We should end the assembly immediately. Adrian considered this. Many nobles were already watching him now, waiting to see how the Duke would respond to the chaos unfolding around him. Ending the gathering suddenly might confirm that fear had taken control of the palace. Adrian spoke calmly. No. Let the celebration continue. Rowan looked surprised. But Adrian interrupted gently. If our enemy wanted panic, we will not give it to them. Rowan hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. Guards began clearing the area while servants quietly removed the bodies and broken glass. Within minutes the music started again, though now the entire hall watched every movement with nervous attention. Adrian stepped closer to Elara while the crowd slowly returned to its conversations. He spoke in a low voice meant only for her. 2 witnesses dead. Elara nodded. Which means someone powerful is protecting this plan. Adrian's eyes moved slowly across the hall again. And they are standing somewhere in this room. Elara followed his gaze. Her attention passed over many faces until it settled briefly on Lord Benedict Hale once more. The advisor stood near the king again, speaking calmly with the same gentle smile as before. If he felt fear, he hid it perfectly. Adrian noticed where Elara was looking. You suspect him. Elara answered quietly. I suspect many people. Adrian's expression remained thoughtful. Then we must give them a reason to make a mistake. Elara looked at him carefully. What do you intend to do? Adrian's voice dropped slightly. Something they will not expect. Elara studied his face for a moment before nodding once, because she understood what he meant. If the conspirators believed their plan was still working, they might attempt another move tonight. And if that happened, Adrian intended to be ready. Across the hall, Lord Benedict Hale lifted his glass and smiled politely while speaking with the king. Yet his eyes moved quietly through the room as well. He had seen the second attacker fall. He had seen the guard run to the balcony. And most important of all, he had seen the Duke remain calm despite everything. That calm troubled him more than the failed attacks. Because a calm enemy was often the most dangerous kind. And as the music continued through the Grand Winter Assembly, both sides of the quiet war inside the palace realized something important. The game had already begun. And before the night ended, someone inside that hall would make one final move that would change everything. But the person planning that move did not yet understand one critical mistake. The female guard who acted first in the crowded palace gathering had already begun to see the entire path of the conspiracy. And when the next attack came, she would be waiting for it. The music inside the ballroom tried to return to normal, but no one truly believed the night was normal anymore. People spoke in softer voices now. Servants moved more carefully. Guards watched every movement in the room. Duke Adrian Valmere stood near the edge of the hall with Elara Thorne a few steps away from him. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The second assassin had died only minutes earlier. 2 attackers in one night. 2 witnesses silenced before they could reveal who sent them. That was no accident. Adrian looked slowly across the ballroom again. So, he said quietly, someone inside this palace is very determined. Elara answered in the same calm tone. Yes. Her eyes moved toward the nobles standing near the king. Which means whoever is behind this has power, she continued. Enough power to move freely inside the palace. Adrian nodded slightly. And enough fear, he added, to silence their own men. For a moment they simply watched the crowd. Then Adrian spoke again. Walk with me. Elara followed him as he moved slowly along the wall of the hall. To anyone watching, it looked like a noble speaking quietly with a guard about security matters. But their conversation was much more important than that. Adrian lowered his voice. The second attacker tried to poison my drink. Yes. And the first tried to reach me through the crowd. Yes. Adrian glanced toward her. So the prisoner below spoke the truth. Elara nodded once. The target was never the king. Adrian looked across the room again. The target was me. For a moment neither of them spoke. Then Elara said something carefully. You already suspected that. Adrian gave a small smile. I did. He stopped walking and looked at her directly. But what I still do not know is why. Elara held his gaze. I might. Adrian raised one eyebrow. Go on. Elara spoke slowly. Your father. Adrian did not react at first. My father, he repeated. Yes. The Duke before you. Adrian's expression changed slightly now. What about him? Elara took a breath. My father investigated corruption inside the royal court 12 years ago. Adrian nodded slowly. Yes, I know. He discovered something. What? Elara's voice grew quieter. Evidence that several powerful nobles were secretly moving money and influence between provinces. Adrian listened carefully. And you believe the same people are still active today? Yes. And you think they killed your father? Elara met his eyes. I know they did. Adrian remained silent for a moment. Then he asked the question that had been waiting between them since the beginning. And what does that have to do with me? Elara hesitated. Then she answered honestly. Your father was one of the nobles my father investigated. The words hung between them. For a few seconds the noise of the ballroom seemed far away. Adrian did not look angry. He looked thoughtful. So, he said slowly, you joined the royal guard to investigate the palace. Yes. And eventually you believed I might be involved. Elara did not lie. Yes. Adrian nodded once. That is reasonable. She looked slightly surprised. You are not angry. Adrian gave a quiet breath. My father was not a perfect man. Elara waited. Adrian continued. There were many things he did during his time in power that I later discovered were questionable. Elara studied him carefully. You knew. Some of it. And you did nothing. Adrian's voice became firm. I tried. That answer surprised her more. When my father died, Adrian continued, I began looking into his dealings myself. And I discovered he had been meeting secretly with several advisors and nobles inside the court. Elara's heart began beating faster. Which advisors? Adrian turned his head slowly toward the center of the ballroom. His eyes settled on one man. Lord Benedict Hale. The royal advisor still stood beside the king speaking politely with diplomats. Adrian spoke quietly. My father trusted him completely. Elara followed Adrian's gaze. Her stomach tightened. You think Hale is behind this? Adrian answered calmly. I think Hale has been moving pieces inside this palace for many years. And tonight, Elara said, those pieces tried to kill you. Adrian nodded. Yes. For a moment they simply watched the advisor across the room. Then Elara spoke. He silenced both attackers. Yes. He controls people inside the palace. Yes. And he has influence over the king. Adrian looked at her. Yes. Elara let out a slow breath. Then exposing him will not be easy. Adrian gave a small smile. No. But then he said something that made her pause. Unless he exposes himself. Elara looked at him. How? Adrian's voice lowered. We give him the opportunity to finish what he started. Elara understood immediately. You want him to try again? Adrian nodded. Yes. And this time we catch him. Elara studied the hall again. Then we need him to believe the Duke is alone. Adrian smiled faintly. That can be arranged. A few minutes later Adrian stepped away from the wall and moved toward one of the balcony doors overlooking the palace gardens. Elara stayed behind near the pillars, watching. Across the hall Lord Benedict Hale noticed Adrian leaving the crowd. His eyes followed the Duke carefully. The advisor finished his conversation with the king and slowly excused himself. Then he walked calmly toward the same balcony door. Elara saw it happen. Her hand moved slowly toward the sword at her side. She waited. Moments later Hale stepped onto the balcony. Adrian was standing near the railing looking down at the gardens below. The night air was cool. Hale approached him slowly. Your Grace, the advisor said pleasantly. Adrian turned slightly. Lord Hale. Hale smiled politely. Quite an evening. Adrian nodded. Indeed. Hale rested his hands lightly on the railing. It is unfortunate the attackers did not survive questioning. Adrian watched him carefully. Yes. Hale continued calmly. One wonders what secrets they might have revealed. Adrian answered quietly. Perhaps they already revealed enough. Hale tilted his head. Oh! Adrian's voice became sharper. They revealed that the king was never the target. Hale's smile faded slightly. And? Adrian stepped closer. They revealed the real target. Silence stretched between them. Finally Hale spoke. And who might that be? Adrian looked directly into his eyes. Me. Hale studied him for a moment. Then something changed. The polite mask disappeared. Well, Hale said calmly, that is unfortunate. From inside his coat he drew a small dagger. You see, he continued, your father was useful to us for many years. Adrian did not move. But when he began losing control of the court, Hale said, we needed someone easier to remove. And now, Adrian said quietly, you need to remove me as well. Hale smiled faintly. Yes. He stepped forward. But the moment he raised the dagger, Elara moved. She burst through the balcony door with her sword drawn. Stop! Guards rushed behind her. Hale froze. For a second he looked from the guards to Adrian. Then he laughed softly. So, he said, the guard who acted first. Elara kept the sword steady. It's over. Hale looked at Adrian again. You planned this. Adrian nodded. Yes. The guards moved forward and seized the advisor. As they forced him to his knees, the music inside the ballroom stopped again. Nobles turned toward the balcony in confusion. Adrian stepped forward and spoke loudly enough for the entire hall to hear. Lord Benedict Hale has just confessed to organizing the attacks tonight. Gasps spread through the crowd. The king himself stepped forward in shock. Hale looked around the silent room. Then he laughed quietly. You may stop me, he said, but the court will never be clean. Adrian looked down at him. Perhaps not. Then he turned toward the guards. Take him away. The guards dragged Hale from the balcony as the entire hall watched in stunned silence. Moments later the ballroom filled with voices again. But this time the whispers carried relief instead of fear. The danger had finally been revealed. Adrian turned toward Elara. For a moment neither of them spoke. Then Adrian said quietly, You were right. Elara tilted her head. About what? You joined the guard to uncover the truth about your father. Yes. Adrian nodded. And tonight you did. Elara looked back toward the ballroom where the conspirator was being taken away. My father died trying to expose corruption. Adrian answered softly. And tonight his work was finished. For a moment the two of them stood there on the balcony while the palace slowly returned to life behind them. Then Adrian looked at her with quiet respect. You acted first tonight. Elara gave a small smile. I was trained to. Adrian shook his head slightly. No. He paused. You were waiting for the right moment. Elara looked toward the ballroom again. Yes. Adrian followed her gaze. And for the first time that night, the tension in the palace finally began to fade. The conspiracy that had moved quietly through the court for years had been exposed. And it had started with one simple moment. During a crowded palace gathering, the female guard acted first. And the Duke took notice.